from a king who dipped his bread in blood to one who had 6 wives at the same time? These are the 5 craziest kings who ever lived, and this is how they ruled? No. 5. The chicken-chasing monarch, King Charles VI of England. The year is 1327, and 14-year-old Edward III has just taken the throne of England after the abdication of his father, Edward II. All is well until a pig breaks loose during a Christmas feast at Windsor Castle. Soon the entire royal court is outside chasing this pig and their horses while it runs around them. As a result, King Charles himself falls into a vat of wine and nearly drowns. It's quite possibly the most humiliating moment in the history of monarchs. But he's not done making a fool of himself yet. Some months later, Queen Isabella, the mother of Edward III, decides that she wants to take control of her son's new reign. She calls for a meeting with him and 4 other nobles, but sneaks in a 5th man, Roger de Mortimer, who she has been having an affair with. Together, they seize the young king and imprison him in his own palace. For the next 2 years, Mortimer rules England as the power behind the throne.
However,
the people of London hate him because he makes them pay high taxes and then uses that money to build the tallest tower in London so he can impress the Queen. Meanwhile, the rest of England supports the young king and wants him released. So when Edward escapes and flees to Normandy, most of England rejoices. But there's still the small matter of deposing his own mother. After all, she tried to kill him. Upon returning to England, Edward imprisoned his mother, her lover, and the 4 other nobles that had helped her hold him captive. He would go on to have a very successful reign, conquering France and restoring order to England after the chaos of the previous few years. In fact, he is considered one of the greatest warriors in English history. As for King Charles, he was never really the same again. His sister once wrote to him saying, "My brother is mad and talks nonsense," and it's believed that he suffered from schizophrenia. Number 4, the blood-drinking king, King Eric IX of Norway. Eric IX comes to power in 872 AD, and he wastes no time cementing himself as a legend by sailing west and discovering not only Greenland but also North America almost 500 years before Columbus. He invites settlers from Ireland to come to Greenland and establish a Christian kingdom there. Eric actually becomes the first king of Norway to convert to Christianity, but that doesn't stop him from being a vicious conqueror. He leads raids against fellow Christians in the British Isles, France, and even the Byzantine Empire. He is actually such a good fighter that the Byzantines offer him pirates' amnesty and make him the governor of a province if he stops attacking them. Back in Scandinavia, his sons are carving out their own territories. They ask their father for permission to attack fellow Norwegian kings, which Eric grants, starting a civil war amongst his subjects. To solve this problem, he goes to war with them, conquering much of Sweden and Denmark along the way. He eventually forces his sons to submit and collect tribute from them, turning them into his vassals. Now, if that wasn't enough, Eric also invades the Holy Land, captures Jerusalem, and sacks the city. Finally, he dies of natural causes, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest warriors and explorers in Viking history. But what is this thing about dipping your bread in blood? Well, the story goes that during the siege of a city, Eric's men stormed the gates and captured the king. When Eric approached the captive king, he held up his loaf of bread and asked for the king's blood to dip it in. This is likely an exaggeration, but there is evidence that Vikings did dip their bread in animal blood instead of butter, since butter was too expensive for common folk. They would often eat their bread with a mixture of milk and blood from the animals they had just slaughtered. Maybe Eric was just doing the same. No, 3. The torture enthusiast king, King Philip II of Spain. Philip II came to power in 1469, when his father died unexpectedly. His mother, Isabella, served as regent until Philip was old enough to rule. In the meantime, the teenage Philip developed an unhealthy obsession with torture, likely inspired by his mother, who had many of her enemies put to death in gruesome ways. When he finally takes the throne, Philip indulges his every whim, building one of the largest prisons for heretics in Spain. He then went on to conquer much of Italy and France, as well as defeat the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Lepanto. But his constant warfare drained the Spanish treasury and led to famine and disease back home. Philip desperately needed some allies. So he married his daughter Joanna to the heir of Portugal and sent her off to live there until she was old enough to rule. Problem was, Joanna was severely mentally unstable and murdered for courtiers after mistaking them for enemies. Her brother, the future King Philip III, was sent to live in Portugal as well. But he hated living in the shadow of his sister and yearned for power. One day, he hatched a plan. While visiting his sister, he had her thrown into a dungeon, locked up and tortured for 17 hours. Then he put her on trial, convicted her of being insane and unfit to rule, and took the throne for himself, then locked up his mother and sister in different castles, where they both died. You might think that Philip was just a power-hungry tyrant, but he didn't stop there. He continued to have his enemies tortured and killed, including those who had merely criticized him or disagreed with his policies. He also executed his own counselors when he didn't get the answer he wanted to hear. Clearly, his obsession with torture did not end with his sister. No, too, the Six Wives King, Henry VIII of England. Henry Tudor came to power in 1509 and was the second monarch of the Tudor dynasty. During his 37-year reign, he oversaw major changes to the Church of England, conquered Ireland, and successfully defended England against the Spanish Armada. But he will mostly be remembered for having 6 wives. You see, Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to produce a male heir, and Henry had become infatuated with one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Desperate to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry broke with the Catholic Church and established himself as the head of the Church of England. Once he was free to marry whoever he wanted, Henry wed Anne and she gave him a son, but she didn't survive childbirth. Just 6 months later, Henry was infatuated with another lady-in-waiting, this time from the household of his deceased second wife. He married Jane Seymour, who bore him a son and then died. Henry then remarried Catherine Howard, who he suspected was cheating on him, so he had her put to death. He then married Catherine Parr, who survived him and outlived 3 of his children. Out of all these marriages, only one of them, his third, resulted in a surviving child, the future Queen Elizabeth I. However, it's important to note that Henry didn't just marry these women because he wanted to. He was forced into 2 of the marriages by his counselors, and was tricked into one of them by his 6th wife. Still, he could have easily ended things with any of his wives through divorce. But instead, he chose to have them executed. Number 1, the Madman King, George II of Great Britain. George II came to power in 1727. Unlike most of the kings on this list, he didn't get there by conquering nations or building great kingdoms. In fact, he spent most of his life in exile after his father, George I, banished him for writing inflammatory pamphlets against the government. When George I died, though his will stipulated that George II should inherit the throne. So Parliament had no choice but to allow him to return to England and become king. Unfortunately, George II had some serious issues, suffered from intense bouts of paranoia and insanity, during which he talked in a made-up language and behaved erratically. At one point, he became convinced that his counselor was poisoning him and ordered his guards to shoot him. They refused, so he fired his pistol at them, but missed. On another occasion, he chased a courtier around his bedroom with a pair of scissors, because he thought he was a French soldier. Yet despite his obvious mental instability, George II managed to rule for over 25 years. He oversaw the beginnings of the 7 Years' War and the War of the Austrian Succession, although he wasn't involved in either conflict. In fact, during his insanity-induced tirades, he would rant about wanting to go to war with France and crush the Austrian Empire. But then he would wake up and have no memory of giving such orders. So technically, it was his ministers that were running the country while he had frequent nervous breakdowns and chased imaginary enemies around the palace. It would be unfair to call him a bad king, however, since he accomplished quite a bit during his more lucid moments. If you enjoyed this video, then hit that like and subscribe. And comment below if you think there are any other crazier monarchs than these kings.